This is a map of Canadian home ownership in 2011, where about 60% of people had a home of their own. Just 10 years later, this number saw a massive decline, with an average of about 2% fewer people now being able to afford a full house of their own. In places like Ontario, Canada saw a more than 3% decline in home ownership from 2011 to 2021. But this number is seen throughout the country. Another key statistic to explain this is this chart, which shows how the average price of housing almost doubled in just 6 years. In 2018, the average price for homes was around $490,000. This is now up to a staggering $700,000. But what has caused these massive changes? 2 words: Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister of Canada. Canada is widely recognised as one of the best countries in the world. Canadians are known for their politeness, their cordial personalities, and most importantly, the best maple syrup in the world. But recently, Canada has also been gaining notoriety for a few less endearing things, like its high level of debt and housing which has become absolutely unaffordable. In fact, it is quite heartbreaking to see homes that have been around since the 1950s now in the market for millions of dollars, often leaving them unoccupied for months or even years, whilst many middle-class citizens are still struggling to move out of their parents' homes. The fact is very simple to understand. The price of homes has gone up, but the income levels of citizens have stagnated and simply do not keep pace with housing, and many Canadians find themselves deeply indebted. But what is the deal with the housing crisis in Canada? Let me explain. If you look at China and many other densely populated countries, it is easy to see the reason for the housing crisis. Despite economic mismanagement and other socio-economic issues, the big reason can often be attributed to a lack of space, or at least a decent location to set up a town and build homes. However, Canada has no such issues, being one of the biggest countries in the world by landmass, but its population is ranked only 38th. Now, this is not a big problem, and when you have fewer people with a very high employment rate like Canada does, it removes the burden of social welfare for many of those who do not contribute to the country's economy. Now, we should mention that not all housing in Canada is extremely expensive. If you take a drive out of the city, you are bound to come across a couple of townships, and housing here is mostly affordable for those who make a living in the city. But since work and the whole economy function in these urban hubs, it should come as no surprise that most Canadians prefer to live as close to their jobs as possible. This has naturally led to a massive migration to large urban centres. On top of this, Canada also had the highest growth in population from 2016 to 2021 of all the G7 countries, but it was mostly driven by immigrants who had established themselves in many of these urban centres. Unlike the United States, the immigrants who do get to Canada are often highly trained and actually contribute to the economy without dragging down the welfare system. However, this has led to a massive increase in people moving to these bigger cities, which subsequently spikes the price of housing. To put this into perspective, Canada welcomed over 1 million people into the country in 2021 to 2022, which meant a population surge of roughly 3%, 2.7%. However, many of these immigrants did take up skilled jobs and contribute to the Canadian economy as a functional manner. So this means that immigration is not the biggest problem. Perhaps the problem lies in something else. Why does Canada have a housing crisis? Well, the answer to this is rather simple and boils down to one thing: housing supply. You see, Canada is currently one of the worst first world countries when it comes to sustainable housing projects. In comparison to other G7 countries, Canada also has the worst housing supply per capita at 424 for every 1,000 people as of 2022 data. The Federal Housing Agency has already mentioned that more than 6 million new homes need to be built in order for the country to come closer to restoring housing affordability by 2030. Unfortunately, recent data suggest that at the current rate, Canada is currently building new homes at almost half the speed they're supposed to if this target was to be met. Now, the next big question is why the country is not ramping up the building of these homes, and why is this such a big issue in a country that has always been known for its prosperity and success. You see, from an outsider's point of view, Canada is often seen as a great place if you want to live in peace and succeed. Whilst the United States might be the land of opportunity, its lack of stability and massive political infighting can be tiresome. This is in stark contrast to Canada, which offers a good, clean environment with great people. But it does seem like this dream is coming to an end unless Canada can figure out how to fix this housing issue. So why doesn't the country simply build new houses? Well, unfortunately, it is not as simple as putting a few planks together and adding some drywall. Some of the biggest obstacles for the country involve things like a lack of skilled labour, for one. You see, Canada is moving more and more toward a white-collar culture, and people are focused on jobs that require them to study long-term to earn higher wages. The desirability of blue-collar jobs is slowly melting away like the Canadian snow once spring comes around. As of the latest data, there are close to 80,000 vacancies in the construction industry, which does leave a lot on the table and means that no one is really interested in building these new homes. But there is actually a reason why many people choose not to partake in these industries, and it has to do with the regulatory red tape. If we look at some opinions, experts have estimated that it takes close to a decade for land to go from being unacquired to building houses. The main reason for this is bureaucracy. Builders and developers need to wade through a ton of red tape, which includes getting numerous approvals that have taken years in some cases. For some reason, the Canadian government needs to finally comb through everything before they can approve housing. And if you've ever been to a government outlet, you understand that speed is not necessarily its biggest priority. One thing that Canada has done great at is keeping high-rise buildings to a minimum, and this is primarily due to regulations permitting single-family developments while leaving the mid to high-rise options only for densely populated locations. But even more frustratingly, these land developers and owners often have to buy land and sit on it for years. By the time they do receive approval for their developments, they have spent so much money on things like property taxes and other expenses to keep the land. In the meantime, they haven't made a single cent of income. With the building process not being much cheaper, you can see that a single development can quickly run someone out of a couple of $1 million over the span of a decade, and this needs to be recovered. The easiest way to recover it is to place the burden on the consumer, and since the housing crisis means there is a shortage of good homes, people can either take it or leave it. It simply boils down to overregulation costing developers money, and these costs being naturally transferred to the consumer. On top of this, the rules, or scarcity, also apply with limited options available. Another main cause for this can be traced back to the 2008 financial crisis. After this significant slump in markets, fixed investments now yield a lower income, which means that many investors have moved to the housing markets or real estate. Many foreign investors have also noticed the value of investing in real estate. Since the Canadian real estate market has continued to climb, a massive flood of investments during 2020 has seen stats indicate that around 42% of housing in places like Nova Scotia, British Columbia, New Brunswick, and subdivisions of Vancouver all being investor-owned. On the upside, the large majority of these investors are local, but non-resident investors account for about 14.9% of housing in student centre subdivisions of Vancouver. The number drops to around 7% across British Columbia. This means that many of the homes are currently owned by non-visual residents, and it can be debated on how vacant these properties are. Essentially, the housing crisis boils down to a few issues that are driving up the cost of these homes. Primarily, it is the red tape for developers to endure before building, whilst investment is also driving up the price due to higher yields in comparison to fixed income investment returns. Now, Canada is trying to keep up pace with housing, but another massive issue is also coming to the forefront: the debt crisis. The cost of living, primarily driven by inflation, which can be explained by global geopolitics, has seen the expandable income of citizens drop to staggering rates. As prices have outpaced savings, many buyers turn to borrowing, which has led to 2022 seeing record levels of debt. In fact, it is estimated that for every dollar of disposable income, Canadians have a debt of $1.85. More strikingly is the fact that 57% of household debt is directly tied to mortgages. Among G7 nations, it makes Canada one of the most indebted developed countries in the world. In fact, the household debt to GDP ratio has reached a level higher than that of the US in the months and years leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. By the second quarter of 2023, data has shown that mortgage payments have now reached a level of almost 60%, 59.3% of household income, which is 43% higher than it was in 2021. This adds another element of crisis to the Canadian household situation. In fact, it discourages many new investors from moving into real estate at the current price, perhaps waiting for an inevitable house price correlation to take place. If we were to put this into perspective, if you took out a $500,000 25-year mortgage at the typical 1% variable rate on January the 1st, 2022, your mortgage payment in the third quarter of 6% rate would mean a jump from around $1,890 per month to a staggering $3,222 per month. This jump took place in roughly 9 months, and even news outlets have confirmed this in various ways, although not as direct as many statisticians have indicated. Unfortunately, salaries have simply not kept up with this expense, and on top of this, the cost of basic goods like groceries has also climbed to all-time highs, with numerous energy issues around the world directly contributing to higher inflation. But many might even argue that with a fixed-rate mortgages being a better option, many investors might have opted for these kinds of investments. But if you remember back to the pandemic and the 2020 global crisis, variable rate mortgages were offered at substantial discounts, whilst rates were at near rock bottom. This was perhaps a calculation error, as many had expected rates to remain low due to banks wanting to defer fixed-rate mortgages, with home buyers having spent a record low on interest in the decade prior. Many had expected these low rates to continue, whilst neglecting the potential for an international energy crisis that spiked massive inflation. Since Canada doesn't actually offer full-term fixed-rate mortgages, many mortgages at fixed prices are only valid for around 5 years before the actual interest rates take effect. This means that after 5 years, many households are hit with massive bills, and they simply cannot afford the same home they did 5 years prior. With many people realising this and downsizing, it simply adds to the problem. You see, with limited housing options available, those looking to downsize can find themselves paying more for a smaller home due to the demand. Surprisingly, delinquency is at an all-time low in Canada, just cracking the 0% mark. But this can be explained by many households simply toughing out the conditions, expecting a rate reset to eventually recur as things stabilise. However, to tough it out, it means more and more Canadians have to go into debt. Many Canadians also had the fortune of building substantial savings during the pandemic, which is mostly attributed to the lockdowns, which essentially prevented people from overspending, as they would often do. Checkable and at notice deposits have seen a substantial increase to 40% between 2019 and 2022, which has helped to dampen the blow of massive inflation. Unfortunately, these savings were intended for retirement for many Canadians, and now many have depleted their retirement savings, which once again creates a problem down the line. As we move into 2024, a new phenomenon is starting to rear its head. With the prices of housing being so high, it has slowly begun to stagnate due to the lack of buyers. Even those who are looking to sell or downsize find themselves in a situation where they simply do not get the return on their investment, often having to sell for lower or having to create more debt by toughing it out. Essentially, it creates a vicious cycle that keeps Canadians in debt and forcing many to take on new debt. The low supply of housing does keep prices at a stable level, but with so many variables, it does make it extremely hard to predict what could happen moving forward. It is worth looking at the conservative lending practices in Canada. Historically, Canada has been somewhat reserved when it comes to free lending, and this does sway things in a positive direction. A RE/MAX report has indicated the low loan to value ratios and the pool of buyers with a credit score of more than 660 shrinking, indicating that a home investment is low risk. However, this should be taken with a grain of salt, as RE/MAX is a real estate agency with the main goal of selling homes. Regardless of the data and the speculation, the current trend is highly unsustainable for Canadians, and many financial experts to speculate that this housing crisis could quickly become financial. So, while real estate is and always has been a good investment, it seems like only cash buyers can now benefit from this.